Hell.
Dust Creek's Last Supper, the girl who ate with her enemy. The empty town. The wind carried dust like prayer ash across the empty street of Dust Creek. Wooden signs swung on broken hinges, their groans mixed with the dry rattle of mesquite branches. The town had been dead since the fever 2 summers back. Only one lamp still burned after sunset, the one inside Jed Carter's old diner. He didn't run it anymore. The place was a habit, not a business. Every evening, just before the sun fell behind the red ridge, he'd strike a match, light the lantern by the counter, and let the glow spill over empty stools. The habit kept him company. Maybe it fooled the silence into thinking he wasn't alone. He'd been a drifter once, a ranch hand, a hired gun for a cattle line that didn't survive the drought. His wife, Clara, had tried to turn the diner into something more than a shack for travelers. She'd hung curtains, planted basil in tin cups, baked bread on Sundays. Fever took her quick and merciless. After that, Jed stayed because leaving would have meant admitting she was gone. Outside the desert was a dull gold fading to rust. He stepped onto the porch, rubbing the callus on his thumb where his wedding band used to sit. The air smelled of iron and dust storm. Then beneath that, something else. Smoke. No, not smoke. Sweat. Flesh. A shape wavered through the heat shimmer on the far side of Main Street. At first, he thought it was a coyote limping through the dust. Then it stood upright. A woman, thin, staggering, wrapped in a torn deerskin coat too heavy for the heat. Her hair was black, tangled with sand. Her face streaked with blood and clay. She reached the hitching post across from the diner, took one step up the boardwalk, and collapsed. Jed froze. The instinct ran deep: stranger equals danger, especially if she was Apache. He'd seen enough raids and reprisals to know how fast a bullet could follow an act of pity. But the wind shifted and he heard a sound no raider would make: a small broken gasp. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching the grit. Up close, she looked barely 20. Her lips were cracked white, her eyes sunken pupils wide with thirst. He crouched, touched her wrist. Warm, faint pulse. Hell, he muttered. He slid his arms under her shoulders and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her inside, pushed the door open with his hip, and laid her on one of the benches. The lantern's light fell across her face, skin dark from sun, not dirt, with a thin cut across her cheekbone. A necklace of small bones hung at her throat. Jed fetched the tin cup from the counter, filled it with water from the barrel, and held it to her lips. She didn't drink at first, then instinct took over, and she swallowed fast, choking. He steadied her head until the coughing eased. When she opened her eyes, the pupils widened in fear. She tried to sit up. He raised a hand. Easy. You're safe here. She didn't understand or didn't believe. Her gaze darted to the revolver on his hip. He took it off, set it on the counter behind him, and stepped back. See, no harm meant. Her breathing slowed. He turned to the stove, knelt, and opened the old iron door. The ashes inside were cold. He struck another match, watched it flare yellow, then fed in a handful of mesquite chips until the fire caught. The smell of sap filled the room, sharp and comforting. He poured what was left of last night's stew into a pot, beans, onions, bits of jerky gone soft, and set it above the flame. Behind him, the girl whispered something, words rough with another tongue. Apache, maybe. He didn't answer. He wouldn't have known what to say. When the stew began to steam, he dipped a spoonful into a bowl and placed it on the table. Eat. She didn't move. He pointed again, then stepped back until he was against the wall. The girl watched him wary, then crawled toward the bowl. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. She ate like an animal that still expected a kick. Jed stood by the doorway, watching her chew, swallow, pause to breathe. He realized he hadn't spoken to another human in nearly 2 months. His voice sounded foreign in his own ears when he finally said, "Name's Jed Carter." No answer. He tried again. "You alone out there?" She stopped eating, lifted her head. For a moment, her eyes met his, dark, clear, full of something older than fear. Then she looked away and muttered a single word that sounded like a name, Nahila. He repeated it softly, testing the shape of it. Nahila. She nodded once, the smallest confirmation. The wind outside rose, pushing sand against the windows like 1,000 whispered arguments. Jed went to close the shutters. When he turned back, she was staring at the door, her shoulders tense, as if expecting pursuit. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself once after a skirmish by the Rio Grande, where both sides lost more than they'd gained. "Who's after you?" he asked. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She only touched her stomach and shook her head. Not hunger, something deeper. Jed poured a second bowl, set it on the counter for himself, and sat opposite her. The firelight painted the room in copper and shadow. They ate without words. Outside, the wind died down, leaving a stillness that felt like a truce. When the bowls were empty, she leaned back against the wall, eyelids fluttering. Sleep came fast, unguarded. Jed watched her for a long time, then pulled his coat from the peg and draped it over her shoulders. He sat at the counter, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, to the sound of her breathing, steady and human. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. The sound echoed through the dead town like a prayer that hadn't found its God. For the first time in years, Jed didn't eat alone. The stranger under his roof. Dawn crept into Dust Creek like a trespasser. Pale light filtered through cracks in the shutters, catching the floating ash above the stove. Jed Carter was already awake, boots on, coffee boiling in a dented pot. The girl still slept where he'd left her, curled beneath his coat on the bench. Her breathing was steady now. For the first time, her face was peaceful, stripped of fear. He studied her in the silence, the scars around her wrists, the torn edge of her moccasins, the dust caught in her hair. Whoever she'd been before last night, the desert had nearly erased it. He poured a tin cup of coffee, took a sip, and winced, bitter as regret. He added another scoop of grounds. It didn't help. A low groan stirred from the bench. The girl blinked against the light eyes, unfocused. Jed set the cup down. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you here." She didn't move at first. Her gaze swept the room, the door, the windows, his holster on the counter, then landed on him. The weight of it stopped him cold. No fear, just watchfulness. He reached for the pot on the stove and ladled beans into a bowl. The spoon scraped the iron with a small metallic sigh. Food. She pushed herself upright, every motion wary. Her lips moved, shaping words that came out in broken English. Why? Jed frowned. Why? What? Why? Help. He didn't have a clean answer. He'd asked himself the same thing half the night. He thought of Clara, of the fever, of how no one had come when she cried out. Maybe that was reason enough. Seemed the right thing to do, he said finally. She stared a moment longer, then took the bowl. The smell of beans filled the room, earthy, faintly sweet. She ate slowly, now not desperate like before. He noticed she held the spoon awkwardly, like someone who hadn't used one often. When she finished, he nodded toward the window. Storms passed. You can rest here till you're strong enough to move on. Her brow furrowed. Move on. Where he shrugged. Wherever your trail leads. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet scrape of wood, she stood and walked to the window. The sun had just cleared the ridge, painting the empty street gold. She pressed her fingers to the glass, like she was testing if the world outside was real. Jed stepped to the door, meaning to fetch water from the barrel. When he opened it, wind rushed in cold and clean after the storm. He paused on the threshold. The street was deserted, the sand swept clean of prints. Behind him, the girl's voice rose soft but clear. Nahila. He turned. She was pointing to herself. Me. Nahila. He nodded. Jed. She repeated it slow and careful, as if carving it into memory. Jed. The sound of his own name and her accent startled him. It felt older, somehow more honest. He fetched a white handkerchief from the drawer, hung it on a nail beside the door. She tilted her head, curious. Means no lock, he said. You can come and go. I ain't keeping you. For the first time, she almost smiled, a faint curve, quick as wind over sand. Then her eyes drifted toward the stove, toward the flame that still flickered low. She walked closer, crouched beside it, and traced the pattern of heat with her palm. Jed watched, silent. There was reverence in the gesture, something ritual. She picked up a bit of dry clay from the hearth's edge, pressed it into the crack between stones, sealing the air. The fire steadied. He realized she was tending it the way his wife once had, whispering in a tongue he didn't know. "Firewoman," he said quietly. She glanced up, puzzled. "No, keeper." Then pointing at him, "You alone too long." He let out a dry laugh. "That's true enough." The rest of the morning passed in fragments, her washing dust from her face, at the basin him fixing the broken shutter. Words were few, but the rhythm of movement filled the silence better than talk. By afternoon, she'd gathered courage to step outside. Jed followed her onto the porch. The air shimmered with heat. Somewhere far off, a hawk circled the ridge. She looked toward the horizon as if expecting someone to come. "You got people?" he asked. "Had." Her voice thinned to almost nothing. "They say I help wrong child." Jed frowned. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed on the desert distant. He didn't press. The truth would come when it was ready. Out here words were like rain, scarce, precious, and best when they fell on their own. As dusk came, he carried a lantern to the porch. Nahila sat on the step, knees drawn to her chest, eyes on the dying Sunday. He hung the lantern beside her. "You don't have to sit out here," he said. "Coyotes get close after dark." She pointed to the horizon where the last light bled from the sky. "I wait." "For who?" She shook her head. "No who. Wind." He didn't understand, but her calm was contagious. He sat beside her, both watching the red fade to gray. When the chill came, she didn't move closer, but she didn't move away either. The silence between them felt less like absence and more like space being made for something not yet named. The lantern flame danced in the wind. The white handkerchief fluttered on its nail, a small ghost against the night. Fire and salt. By the third morning, the town's silence had changed. It no longer sounded hollow, but expectant, like the air itself was holding its breath. Jed rose before sunrise and found Nahila already outside, crouched beside the water barrel, scrubbing her hands clean with sand. The light caught her skin, turning the brown to bronze, the scars along her forearms to thin silver threads. She didn't flinch when he stepped out. She only nodded once. They worked side by side that morning. He fixed the sagging sign above the porch. She swept dust from the diner floor. Neither spoke much. The rhythm of small labor replaced language. The town remained asleep. No riders, no wagons, just the rustle of grit along window frames, and a distant crow's cry that sounded too far away to matter. When he brought in a sack of flour from the storeroom, she tilted her head at it. "Bread," he smiled faintly. "Used to make it. Before." "Teach," she said simply. He hesitated. It had been years since he'd baked anything. Years since he'd seen another pair of hands working the same dough. Still, he poured water into a bowl, added a pinch of salt, and gestured for her to join him. She watched closely as he stirred, mimicking each motion. Her touch was careful, reverent. When the dough stuck to her fingers, she laughed, soft, low, like a rusted bell finding its voice again. He found himself laughing, too. The sound startled them both. When the loaves were set near the fire, Nahila reached for a handful of damp clay and sealed the cracks between bricks so the heat wouldn't escape. Jed frowned. "Where'd you learn that, my mother?" she said. "Clay keeps fire alive when wind wants it dead." He nodded, watching her palms move, strong, precise, marked by survival. Later, while the bread baked, he cleaned his revolver on the counter. She watched him with guarded curiosity. "You fight." "Used to," he said. "Not proud of it." "Apache fight too," she said quietly. "Always fighting someone." Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired. When the smell of baked bread filled the room, Jed pulled the loaves out with a folded rag. He tore one open, steam curling into the dim air. The crust cracked like dry earth, the inside white and soft. He handed her half. "Go on." She took it, carefully sniffed, then bit. The salt caught on her tongue. Her eyes widened surprise then, something like memory. "Good," she murmured. Jed sat across from her. They ate slowly, the sound of chewing blending with the faint pop of firewood. He broke the silence. "You said your people turned you out." Why, Nahila's fingers tightened around the bread. "I fed a white child. Found him after soldiers left. He cried, no mother, no milk. My chiefs say, let him die. I gave him water instead. She looked up at him, defiant but trembling. They call me traitor. Jed's stomach turned. A flash of memory struck the Rio Grande smoke, rising a woman shot in the back while clutching her baby. He'd looked away then. His orders had been to clear the ridge, not question it. He'd obeyed. He swallowed hard. I was one of those soldiers, he said. Nahila froze. The wind outside hissed through the cracks. He expected her to rise to run, but she didn't. She just stared at him, eyes like twin storms. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't stop it either. For a long moment nothing moved but the flame between them. Then Nahila reached forward, tore another piece of bread, and set it in front of him. Eat, she said. He did. Salt burned his tongue, or maybe it was guilt. They finished the loaf in silence. The fire burned low. Later, when Jed reached to pull another log, his hand brushed a live ember. He hissed, jerking back. Nahila was beside him before he could move, catching his wrist. She pressed her cool palm against the burn, holding it there. Too quick, she murmured. Fire test you. Her touch steadied his breathing. He looked at her, the curve of her cheek, the fine ash clinging to her lashes. For a moment the room seemed to narrow, until there was only that touch, that breath, that shared pulse. Thank you, he said softly. She let go and stepped back, the space between them heavy with unsaid things. That evening the wind returned, a slow moan rolling through the empty streets. The sand scratched the windows like fingernails. Nahila patched the shutters with strips of torn cloth, while Jed moved the tables closer to the wall. They worked until the diner looked almost whole again. When the storm hit, it came sudden and alive. Grit filled the cracks, and the lantern swayed on its hook. Jed threw another log into the fire. Nahila crouched beside the wall, holding the clay seal firm. Not too tight, he called. Let it breathe. She knotted hair whipping against her face. The smell of smoke and yeast mingled with dust. It was strange comfort and ruin sharing the same air. When the worst passed, they sat again by the hearth. She touched her face and left a streak of gray across her cheek. He didn't mention it. The mark looked like a war stripe, a memory she hadn't chosen but carried anyway. He poured them both coffee, bitter and thin. She tasted it, winced, but drank. Why you stay here, she asked. He stared into the cup. Because leaving would mean I forgive myself. She looked at him a long while, then said, Forgive not same as forget. He met her gaze. And which one do you choose, I remember, she said. But I don't carry all of it. Only what still burns. The words sat between them like coals. He leaned back, letting them sink in. Near midnight, Nahila rose to check the oven. The fire had fallen low again. She bent to stoke it, and for a heartbeat, the glow lit her face. The soft hollow beneath her eyes, the line of her mouth. She looked tired, but alive. He watched her not out of desire, but out of awe, that something broken could still hold shape against the wind. Jed, she said suddenly, without turning, you fear me now. He shook his head. No, I fear what I made of this land. She straightened, wiping her hands. Then, make it different. She stepped to the doorway and opened it. The air that came in was cold, salted with sand, but it carried the faintest smell of rain. She lifted her face toward it. He joined her. Beyond the street, the horizon glowed faintly, lightning without sound, just the shimmer of a storm dying in the distance. Nahila said something in Apache, quiet, rhythmic. What's that mean, fire eats salt, she replied. But salt remembers fire. He didn't fully understand, but he felt it the way memory burned even after the flame was gone. When night deepened, they spread their blankets near the fire. Nahila lay facing the wall. Jed stayed sitting, staring at the ember that refused to die. After a while he whispered, If I could take back what I did. You can't, she said, not unkindly. But you can feed what's left. He didn't answer. The ember pulsed once, twice, and she turned slightly toward him. Sleep, she murmured. Tomorrow work again. He smiled faintly. You sound like a preacher. No, she said, just tired of ghosts. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full alive, like earth after rain. When dawn came, the fire had burned to white ash. Nahila rose, first kneeling to trace a small circle in the powder, an old Apache sign for renewal. She whispered a prayer, then looked at him. "Today we make more bread," she said. He nodded. "Fire and salt again." "Fire and salt," she repeated, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes. Outside Dust Creek stirred to life, not living, not dead, but something in between, like a heart, remembering how to beat. The hunters come. The wind changed again 3 nights later. It came colder from the north, carrying the smell of horses and iron. Jed felt it before he heard it, the stillness that settles just before trouble arrives. He had grown to read the air like scripture. Wind and silence had their own grammar. He was outside chopping kindling when Nahila called his name from the doorway. "Riders." He straightened axe, paused mid-swing. Down the ridge, 5 silhouettes were crossing the flat's dust, trailing behind them like the ghosts of their own intentions. Men from town. Their pace wasn't casual. Jed's jaw tightened. He'd known this moment would come. Dust Creek had a long memory and short mercy. The town never forgot trespasses that threatened its order, and taking in an Apache woman was a kind of heresy carved deep. He tossed the axe aside and went to the porch. "Inside," he said. Nahila shook her head. "No hide. You don't understand. These men think Apache means enemy. They see you here, they'll—" She stepped forward until the lantern light caught her face. "If I hide, I'm still enemy." Jed stared at her, the calm in her voice cutting through the cold. Shame worked its way beneath his ribs. He nodded once. "Then we faced them." By the time the riders reached the diner, the night had settled hard and blue. Their lanterns threw halos across the sand, catching bits of grit like sparks. The one in front, Deputy Clay, was a big man, with a preacher's posture and a drunk's temper, the sort who quoted scripture right before drawing a gun. "Well, I'll be damned," Clay called. "Jed Carter's place still standing. Thought you'd gone hermit for good." Jed stepped down from the porch, wiping his palms on his trousers. "Evening, Clay." Clay's eyes flicked past him to the doorway where Nahila stood back, straight gaze unwavering. His smile turned thin. "Heard talk you took in one of them. Thought I'd see for myself." Jed didn't move. "She's not one of them. She's a person." Clay snorted. "That's so folks around here ain't keen on mixing breeds or charity for savages." He spat into the dust. "You forgot what they did in '68. Burned wagons, killed children." Jed's voice stayed low. "I remember children dying. Don't recall who set the fires anymore." The words landed heavy. The other men shifted in their saddles. Clay's hand brushed his holster. "You watch your mouth." Nahila stepped out then past the threshold, until she stood beside Jed. Her shadow joined his across the dirt. The men froze. She wasn't shaking. "This your woman?" One of them jeered, his laughter sharp in the cold air. Jed didn't look away. "She's my guest. You'll leave her be." Clay laughed, but it sounded forced. "Guest, huh? Ain't a hotel here, Carter. You're harboring trouble." Jed took one step forward. His boots sank into the dust with a dull thud. "This is my ground, Clay. My fire. My food. If a hungry soul knocks, I feed him. You don't like that ride on." The silence that followed was thick as tar. The men's horses snorted, stamping nervously, catching the scent of unease. Finally, Clay spat again. "You lost your damn mind, soldier," maybe Jed said. "But I ain't lost my humanity." Clay's stare lingered a moment longer, then he yanked his reins. "Come on, boys. Let the fool rot with his Indian." The group wheeled around and rode off, hooves drumming into the dark until the sound bled into the wind. Only when the last echo faded did Jed's shoulders drop. The chill of adrenaline left his hands trembling. He turned back. Nahila hadn't moved. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. "Now they come again." "Let 'em," Jed answered. "We did nothing wrong." Inside, the fire had burned low. He added wood, watching the sparks rise like a handful of tiny prayers. The orange glow stretched across the walls, throwing their shadows together into one. Nahila sank onto the bench, silent. After a long while, she said, "They fear what they don't know. You not like them." Jed poured water into a tin cup, passed it to her. "Used to be." She took it, eyes fixed on the flames. Why change? He thought of the woman he'd left on the ridge years ago, of the baby's cry that had followed him through every dream since. Because guilt gets heavy, he said, and I got tired of carrying it alone. Nahila looked up then, something shifting behind her gaze. Alone, she repeated quietly. No more. They sat without speaking. Outside, the coyotes started again, howling in long, broken notes that sounded less like hunger and more like mourning. The night wore on. The wind grew restless, scraping along the windowsills. Jed stood and checked the rifle hanging behind the door. Habit, not threat. Still, he felt that old military caution settle back into his bones. Nahila watched him. You ready, fight? He shook his head. I'm ready if they force it, but I've had enough of killing for one lifetime. She nodded, understanding. My father say same before he die. He looked over, startled. She rarely spoke of her family. She continued, her voice low and even. He say war never end, only move inside man's heart. Harder to stop there. Jed stared at the fire. Your father was a wise man. Dead man, she corrected gently. Neither spoke again for some time. Hours later, when the wind finally dropped, Jed stepped outside. The moon had climbed high, silvering the dunes and painting the diner's roof in pale light. He walked to the edge of the porch and looked down the road the riders had come from. Empty now. But their dust still lingered, faint as guilt. Behind him he heard Nahila moving. She came to stand beside him, wrapping a worn blanket around her shoulders. Her hair caught the moonlight loose, and black, the same color as the sky above them. They come at dawn, she said simply. How do you know? Always when light weak, when men brave and afraid same time. He couldn't argue with that. He'd been one of those men once. When dawn came, it came slow, bleeding pink through the cracks of night. They shared bread and coffee in silence. Each motion felt ritual, pouring, passing, eating. The world outside felt suspended, waiting to judge them. By mid-morning, hoofbeats returned. Not 5 this time, 7, maybe 8. Jed's stomach turned cold. He saw the dust before the shapes. Nahila stood beside him, chin raised. You can still run, he said quietly. I run all my life. No more. He wanted to tell her courage wasn't worth dying for, but something in her steadiness stopped him. The riders pulled up just beyond the porch. Clay again, face red from whiskey and lack of sleep. 2 men carried rifles across their saddles. Another held a coiled rope. Morning, Clay said, voice like gravel. You had time to think on our talk. Jed stepped down, rifle still slung, but his hands empty. I thought plenty. My answer's the same. Clay's lip curled. Then I reckon this is a citizen matter. Town wants peace. That means no savages on our land. Nahila's voice cut through before Jed could reply. This not your land. Apache live here before Dust Creek ever name itself. The words startled the men. Her English wasn't perfect, but her tone was carved from stone. Clay laughed harshly. You hear that, boys? She's schooling us on history. He turned back to Jed. Move aside, Carter. We'll take her off your hands. Maybe the fort can find her a proper place. Jed didn't move. There's no proper place for mercy, is there? Clay's eyes hardened. He drew his revolver slowly, not to fire yet, just to remind everyone who had the power. Last chance. Jed raised his hands, slightly palms open. You're making a mistake. Already made it when you brought her in, Clay said. The air tensed. A horse snorted, stamping the dirt. Jed felt the old war rhythm crawl back into his veins, the seconds stretching thin, every breath measurable. Then something broke it. Nahila stepped down from the porch and stood in the open. Her blanket fell to the ground. She lifted both hands empty. The morning light turned her skin to bronze, her eyes dark and steady. You want take me, she said. Then you look at me, not at him. Me. Clay hesitated. The certainty drained from his face for a heartbeat. Jed seized it. You see her, Clay. She's not your story. She's not your enemy. She's a woman who's had enough of men like us deciding who deserves to live. The deputy's gun wavered. The men behind him murmured, uneasy, unsure what justice looked like anymore. Get on your horses, Jed said quietly. Go home. One man obeyed, first tugging his reins. Another followed. Clay swore, spun his horse, and for a moment looked ready to draw again, but the look in Jed's eyes stopped him. Not fury, conviction, the kind that doesn't need a weapon. He spat into the dust. "You'll regret this, Carter. Maybe. But I'll sleep clean." They rode off slower this time, the sound fading into the hills. When they were gone, Nahila turned to Jed. Her breath came fast but steady. "You fight with words," she said. "Better than bullets." He gave a tired smile. "I've fired enough of both." Inside, the fire waited like a patient witness. He shut the door, slid the bolt. "You think they stop?" she asked. "No," he said, "but we made them doubt. Sometimes that's the first crack in a wall." She nodded, eyes on the flames. "Doubt make men dangerous. Also human," he said. She looked at him for a long time, then reached for the loaf they'd baked the day before. She tore a small piece, handed it to him. Her fingers brushed his again. He took it, their eyes holding longer than either meant. "Guess we're both hunted now," he said. Her mouth curved in a quiet, weary smile. "Then we share fire." Outside, the wind rose, carrying away the hoofbeats, the threats, and maybe, just maybe, the first layer of their fear. Inside, two shadows leaned toward the same flame, bound not by blood or law, but by the simplest covenant left in a world that had forgotten kindness to face what came together. The Last Supper dawn came thin and gray, washing the desert in the color of bone. The air tasted of ash and distance. Jed had slept little. Every sound outside, the rustle of wind, the groan of timber, made him reach for his rifle. But the riders never came back. When he finally stepped outside, the world felt hollowed out by silence. Nahila was already awake, standing by the dry riverbed behind the diner. Her hair lifted in the wind, black against the pale sky. "They won't stop," she said when she saw him. He nodded. "I know. I go. They find me here, you die too." Jed leaned against the post, watching the light climb over the ridge. "Maybe I'd rather die doing something that matters." She frowned. "You don't owe me. Maybe I do." He wanted to tell her why the burned village, the woman he hadn't saved, but the words wouldn't come. Some things weren't meant to be spoken, only undone. She turned away, eyes on the horizon. "If I leave, I live. You stay free." He shook his head. "Freedom's not worth much if it means eating alone." Nahila hesitated. The wind pulled strands of hair across her face. Her eyes softened, but her mouth stayed hard. "You talk like old man. Been called worse." That earned him a breath of laughter. Small, reluctant, beautiful. They went inside. The diner smelled of last night's smoke. Jed lit the stove again, set out what little they had, left half a loaf of bread, a slice of salted pork, one onion. He laid them carefully on the counter, as though the arrangement itself was sacred. "This all?" Nahila asked. "All that's left." She stared at the food, then at him. "Last meal." He nodded. "If that's what it is." He sliced the bread, handed her half. "Eat." She didn't sit. Instead, she stood across from him, both hands around the bread like it was something alive. "When we eat together," she said slowly in my people's way, "it means we share the same fire." "You sure?" Jed met her eyes. "I'm sure." They ate in silence. The fire popped softly, filling the room with the smell of wood and salt. Outside, a dust devil spun through the street, scattering the ash from the night before. Through the open door, Jed could see the white handkerchief still fluttering on its nails, stubborn against the wind. When the bread was gone, Nahila laid her hand flat on the table between them. Her fingers trembled slightly. "Jed," she said. It was the first time she'd spoken his name without fear. "If I die, remember me not as Apache. Just woman." He reached across, his rough palm covering hers. "And if I die, remember me not as soldier. Just man." Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked down, then up again. The light caught her eyes, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw every mile of pain between them, burned villages, empty cradles, the slow forgiveness of hunger shared. Then she stepped around the table. Jed didn't move. When she touched his face, the gesture wasn't passion. It was recognition. Her hand lingered on the scar along his jaw, tracing it like reading something written there long ago. He closed his eyes, breathing her in the smoke, the sweat, the salt of bread still on her skin. When he opened them again, the world had narrowed to her heartbeat against his chest. She pulled back first. "Sunrise," she whispered. "New fire start." He nodded, throat tight. "Then we start with it." They stepped outside together. The sky was a sheet of pale gold. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes called their cries thin and distant. Nahila turned east toward the desert. "They come with light." "Let them," Jed said. She looked at him once more, then down at their hands still linked. "My name," she said softly, "means she who eats with fire." He smiled. Fitting. The first rays of sun reached them, painting their faces in the same color. For a long while they stood there motionless, two survivors caught between endings and beginnings. If the riders came again, the desert kept their noise. If death waited, it waited patiently. But in that small hour, Dust Creek wasn't empty anymore. Inside the diner, on the table where the breadcrumbs still lay, the fire's glow flickered once steady and bright, as if refusing to die. Where the wind rests. A year passed, though time in Dust Creek no longer moved the way it once had. The desert erased what it didn't need. Trails vanished under wind. Bones sank beneath dust. Only the diner remained weathered, but upright, a stubborn square of wood and light against the endless plain. Travelers sometimes found it by accident, drifters, lost ranch hands, wagon men who'd missed the road to Tucson. They'd come in hungry and quiet, and they'd leave full, without quite knowing why the place felt holy. The sign above the porch had been repainted in a careful, uneven hand, "For those who come hungry." Inside, the air smelled of bread and juniper smoke. The shelves held jars of bean salt flour. A new clay stove stood in the corner, the bricks sealed, smooth, the fire inside constant and low. Jed Carter sat by the window, gray now along the edges of his beard. He cleaned his knife with slow, steady motions, the kind of work a man does when he isn't in a hurry. Across from him, Nahila kneaded dough, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair braided tight against the heat. The rhythm of her hands matched the soft whoosh of the fire's breath. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. Every so often the wind pushed at the shutters, testing them. It never stayed long. The place had learned to keep the wind as a guest, not a master. Jed glanced out the window. The ridge glowed red under the sun, the same color as the day they met. "Never thought I'd see this place alive again," he said. Nahila wiped flour from her fingers. "Place live because we stay." He smiled. "You sound like a preacher." "No," she said. "Preacher talk. I cook." He laughed quietly. The sound filled the room like music no one had played in years. Outside, a pair of hawks circled high above the flats, their shadows gliding over the sand. Nahila watched them for a while, then said, "When wind stops, that means peace." "Hasn't stopped yet," Jed said. She shook her head. "Not here." She touched her chest. "Here." He reached over, dusting flour from her wrist. The scar where she'd once been bound had faded to a pale line. He traced it gently, not to claim, but to remember. Sometimes at night, the ghosts of Dust Creek came back, the laughter of the old saloon, the squeal of wagon wheels, the brief cry of a child lost long ago. But the sounds no longer haunted. They passed through like the wind, acknowledged, forgiven, gone. Jed rose, walked to the doorway, and leaned against the frame. The sun had begun its slow descent, burning the horizon into copper. Nahila joined him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Evening fire," she murmured. He nodded. "Let's light it." They stepped outside. The air cooled, heavy with sage and dust. Nahila knelt, striking flint until the kindling caught. The flame rose slow and sure, reflecting in her eyes. Jed crouched beside her. When the fire steadied, she whispered something in Apache, a small prayer that sounded like wind through tall grass. He didn't ask what it meant. He only whispered back, "Amen," because it seemed close enough. They sat there until the stars appeared, the desert spreading quiet around them. Coyotes called from the canyons, soft and distant. Jed looked over at her. "You ever miss the old country?" She thought for a moment. "Old country gone, new one here." She nodded toward the diner. "Our fire." He followed her gaze. Through the window, the warm light from the stove glowed across the empty tables, same as it had that first night, but fuller, now richer. He took her hand. "You think the world can forgive what we were?" Nahila squeezed his fingers gently. World forgets. We forgive. The wind sighed, once moving over them slow and tender, then drifted on toward the open plain. In the quiet that followed, Jed felt something settle inside him. Not joy, not sorrow, but peace, deep and clean as rain on dust. He looked out at the horizon. Guess the wind's resting. Nahila smiled. Then so can we. The fire crackled softly, throwing sparks into the dark. One ember, caught on the breeze, rose high and vanished into the sky, carried somewhere beyond Dust Creek, where stories end, but their light keeps traveling. And in that fading glow, the legend of the man and the woman who once shared bread in a dying town lingered, two ghosts made human by hunger, mercy, and flame.